Hi guys, and welcome to the Is It Worth It for the AT-15A, the Tier 7 British tank destroyer. This tank is currently available from the tech tree for 6,500 gold, or it's available from the gift shop. And the question we're going to be asking today is this tank worth 6,500 gold? As per usual, let's start with the history of the tank, and this one is going to be easy because, like most of the tank destroyers on the original British tank destroyer lines, the AT-15A was simply a design. It wasn't even a prototype. So just like the AT-2, the AT-8, the AT-7 and the AT-15, none of these tanks actually existed. They were all designs. They didn't even make it into prototype stage. Elements of the designs were incorporated and were used to build the Tortoise, which is, from the Electo to the Tortoise, the only two TDs on this line that actually existed. All of these tanks were designed roughly around the same time with the same principle in mind, which was a mobile assault gun for use against fortifications. So around 1943 there were a lot of blueprints put together for British mobile assault guns. The AT-15A was just one of them. So I always wondered why the AT-8 was at tier 6 and the AT-7 was at tier 7. The reason was these tanks were designed on paper at exactly the same time, so there's actually no difference. I'm sure there's an AT-3, an AT-4, an AT-5, all the way up to the AT-15 that exists in blueprints as well. The AT-15 and the AT-15A, neither of them came before the other. They were actually both designed side by side. They were variations of the same tank. So yeah, AT-15A never existed. It was simply a blueprint like most of the original British tank destroyer line. So we're going to be comparing the AT-15A against all its Tier 7 tank destroyer premium rivals, and if I'd done this review a year ago, it would have been a lot easier, because back then it only had two rivals. It had the E-25 for the Germans and the Su-122-44 for the Russians. However, in the last year, three other premium tank destroyers have been added at Tier 7, the first being the Su-122S for the Russians, and then the T-28 heavy tank concept was added as a reward tank, along with the M56 Scorpion more recently as a premium. So there are quite a few competitors for the AT-15A. Starting off with the hit points, you can see that the hit points are absolutely huge. It gets 1,050 hit points, significantly more hit points than any of the other tanks up here. It adds a lot of survivability to the tank. However, when this tank was first introduced, or when the AT-15A was first introduced, it only had about 810 hit points. So the hit points were very, very poor on the tank originally. It got a buff in 9.4, and it's made a huge difference to the tank. It comes in at a whopping 65 tons for me. That makes it 5 tons lighter than the heavy tank concept, but significantly heavier than any of the other tanks up here. So it's a very, very heavy tank. And even though on paper, compared to the other tanks, it gets a decent engine, it gets a 650 horsepower engine. 650 horsepower looks okay on paper compared to the other tanks, but because it weighs 65 tons, it means it has a horsepower to weight ratio of just 10. That's the worst horsepower to weight ratio of any of the tanks up here. It has a very, very slow top speed of 20 kilometers an hour. That makes it the slowest of any of the tank destroyers up here. Even the heavy tank concept has a 29 kilometer an hour top speed, so it's a 33% faster tank than the AT-15A. This is not a fast tank, guys. All the other TDs have it significantly beaten. The reverse speed, while we're on the point of speed, the reverse speed is also very, very poor. It only gets a 10 kilometer an hour reverse speed. So both acceleration and reverse are very, very slow. The traverse speed of the hull is also very, very poor. You can see it's got a 24 degree per second traverse speed, significantly worse than most of the other tanks up here. The Su-122S is only slightly faster. However, the T-28 concept is significantly slower. So it's not the worst when it comes to traverse speed, but it's definitely not good, and most of the other TDs have it well beaten. The gun traverse speed on paper is average. It's significantly slower than the E-25. It's got similar gun traverse to the Su-122-44 and the Su-122S, and it's got significantly better gun traverse than the T-28 heavy tank concept or the Scorpion. However, it's got a very, very wide gun arc. mark, and that is a big plus for the tank as well, but we're going to go into that more when we talk about the gun. The view range is pretty average. Now, when this tank came out, it was before the tank destroyer view range nerf, so it didn't have good view range to begin with. It wasn't affected by the nerfs because it's a premium tank, but the view range, as you could see, is still not great. It's very average. It's got worse view range than the E25 or the heavy tank concept, similar view range to the ISU-122S or the Scorpion. In fact, it only beats the SU-122-44 with regard to view range. The signal range is also very average, 570 meters of signal range. Again, some of the other tanks have it beaten, the E25 and the SU-122-44, but it does beat tanks like the ISU-122S or the Scorpion. So view range and signal range, pretty average, maybe even slightly poor. So looking at the stats so far, there's only been one positive. The tank is slow, it's unmaneuverable, the view range is nothing special, the signal range is nothing special. Only the hit points are the big positive so far, but then we get to talk about the armor, which is the biggest positive of the AT-15A. It gets 228 millimeters of frontal armor, significantly better than any of the other tanks up here, including the T-28 heavy tank concept, which only gets 203 millimeters of frontal armor on paper in the garage. The side armor is phenomenal as well. You get 152 millimeters of side armor, again significantly better than any of the other tanks up here, including the heavy tank concept, which only gets 101 millimeters on the side, but the AT-15A gets 101 millimeters on the rear. It's very well armored all round, significantly better than any of the other TDs up here. So what we've got is a slow moving, pretty unmaneuverable tank with a lot of hit points and a lot of armor. So popping into Tanks GG to have a closer look at this armor. Now the first thing you'll notice is the very large cupola, like most British tank destroyers have. This cupola is a weak spot, but I would argue that it's not the weakest part of the frontal armor on this tank, because it can be quite troll. Now just be aware, sometimes I'm going to call this a commander's cupola if I forget myself. It's not a commander's cupola, it's a loader's cupola. Your loader sits in here. A lot of players are going to be shooting this the first opportunity they have to shoot at an AT-15A because it's such a known weak spot. You are going to get shot here, you are going to get penned here, and your loader's going to get knocked out constantly.
Enemy armor is hit. Loader spotted.
And there goes my loader. So Type 59 snuck up behind, put a shot into the loader's cupola, and that's going to be happening a heck of a lot when you drive the AT-15A. So expect to carry a lot of first aid kits and expect to use them when you're driving an AT-15A because that loader is going to need a lot of healing. But the cupola is probably a little bit troll on the AT-15A, at least I find it a little bit troll, because it's got a very weird armor profile. It may not be actually the weakest weak spot on the front of this tank. It might be one of the easier places to hit, and a lot of people aim there automatically, but what you've got is you've got about 190 millimeters of effective armor at the top of the cupola. So if people shoot towards the top of the cupola, the armor is actually quite good. If they shoot the base of the cupola, then you've got about 150 millimeters of armor. If they shoot one side of the cupola, then the armor is very weak. You've only got 134 millimeters of armor. If you shoot the other side, what you can see is the angling means you can get some incredibly troll bounces. So the cupola, it's a little bit troll. It is going to be shot, it is going to be penned by a lot of the tanks this tank faces, but it's not the easiest place to hit. As I say, frontally, you got to hit the base of the cupola to get 150 millimeters of armor. The easier or a weaker spot on the front of an AT-15A is probably something a lot of people don't know about, which is the other cupola, and this one is the commander's cupola. If you shoot here, you will take out the commander, but what you can see here is you've only got 125 millimeters of effective armor, so even though this is a bigger target and easier to hit, the chances of getting the tougher armor or hitting 190 millimeters of armor are much higher. If you go for the smaller cupola, it's only 125 millimeters. So even lower tier tanks that might have problems going through here should be able to pen an AT-15A if they just understand the weak spots or have shots on the smaller cupola. But again, it's amazing how many people don't shoot you here. I can hide my upper glacis, or I can hide my turret by going around a corner, keep this hidden around a corner, and people still don't shoot me here. They're trying to pen me here. So yeah, this cupola is a weak spot that a lot of people don't know about. The lower glacis is extremely well armored. In fact, the whole front of this tank is pretty well armored, depending on whether or not you know how to drive it. The lower glacis is very, very good. Extremely good lower glacis. Even tier 8 heavy tanks are going to have problems penning your lower glacis. The size of the tank, as I say, you can angle this tank around corners. Your gun traverse is amazing. So the side armor is incredibly good to either side of the gun mantlet. So 229 millimeters, 250 millimeters, 228 millimeters. The side armor on both sides is very, very good. Now, something to be aware of is a lot of players think there's a weak spot on the front of an AT-15A that doesn't actually exist, and that weak spot is right here, where the machine gun is. I've seen some hit skins, I've seen some websites that call this a weak spot on an AT-15A, but as you can see from Tanks GG, it's not a weak spot. It looks like a weak spot, it looks very, very flat, but you're actually shooting at some of the thickest armor of the tank if you're trying to hit this machine gun. So sometimes when I'm working my way around a corner, whereas a player might have easy shots on this cupola, might be able to shoot and pen it, they're trying to pen me here because they think it's a weak spot, and it's not. However, what is a weak spot is the upper glacis on this tank, because the upper glacis, even though a lot of people don't shoot you here for some reason, they tend to go for your cupola instead, but the upper glacis is a definite weak spot. You can see that the armor ranges from about 180 millimeters all the way down to about 150 millimeters on the upper glacis. Now, this is fine when you're shooting at an AT-15A and you're on flat ground. If you get above an AT-15A, or if you're in a taller tank and you're shooting down on his lower glacis, or upper glacis I should say, you can see that the armor can be incredibly poor. Shooting down at an AT-15A, the armor drops to about 125 in places. So this is where you want to be shooting. It's much, much easier to pen than either of the cupolas, which you can miss if the tank is moving. Shoot it on the upper glacis, especially if you're in a tall tank. Now, where the AT-15A can negate this weakness is using its gun depression, because the gun depression on the AT-15A is 10 degrees. That means if the AT-15A gets behind a rise or goes hull down and can use its gun depression, what it's doing is it's increasing the angle of its upper glacis, and even though this is the weakest frontal armor on the tank, what you can see is it increases to about 230, 240 millimeters if the tank can get its gun depression into use. So you can make the armor on the front of an AT-15A very, very good by using its gun depression, and also by using its gun depression, what you're doing is you're making it much, much harder to hit the cupola. So you're more chance of hitting the top of the commander's cupola from a lower position shooting up at an AT-15A than you are if you're shooting at it on flat ground. So if an AT-15A gets above you, its armor can be very, very good. Even all its weak spots are very, very difficult to hit. Now, there is one other weak spot I hear a lot of people talk about when they talk about British tank destroyers or the AT-15A, which is the gun itself. What you can see is an incredibly good gun mantlet. Again, another reason why the armor is amazing on this tank. The gun mantlet is special. It really is very, very good gun mantlet armor, capable of taking on any tank it can face, but the area around the gun itself is basically just 101 millimeters of spaced armor. So if you could shoot the gun itself or the area around the gun, you've got far more chance of penning. However, just remember it is spaced armor. There's a chance for the shot to be absorbed. You might hit the gun, which is 25 millimeters of spaced armor, and it's also quite difficult to hit if the driver who's driving the AT-15A knows what he's doing, because he's going to try and keep this tank at an angle, and he's only going to be giving you easy shots at this area when he points his gun at you. If you don't hit it dead straight, you're going to be hitting the edge of the gun mantlet, and as you can see again, the edge of the gun mantlet is very, very good. So you've got to get shots directly in here to pen this tank if you're shooting it frontally. And if you're shooting here frontally, just remember it's shooting you back. So yeah, there are a few weak spots on the front of the AT-15A, and it can be taken out if you know what you're doing. But on the other hand, if the driver who's driving the AT-15A knows how to negate those weak spots, hiding its cupola when coming around corners, as trying to use its gun depression, staying above enemy tanks, and then maybe moving its tank back and forward, using the gun traverse to prevent easy shots into the gun area, then it can be very, very effective. And it also helps that a lot of people don't actually know how to take out one of these things other than shooting at the cupola, which can be quite troll. However, it gets better because the side armor is very, very good. Now, if you're driving an AT-15A, you never ever want to face tanks frontally. Always stay at an angle, always stay slightly angled, because you can see that the upper glacis, which is considered poor on this tank, 150, 160 millimeters here. But if you're driving at an angle, you can get your gun on target at this angle, but what you can see is the upper glacis is now about 185 millimeters of effective armor, so you can negate the weak armor if you know what you're doing. The side armor is absolutely incredible, 152 millimeters of side armor, and when you're at this angle, there's very few weak spots anyone can actually shoot at. You can side scrape, you can work this tank around corners, you can keep this gun, you can turn it towards the enemy and work around corners. The side armor, incredibly good. And not only that, but the tracks count as 30 millimeters of spaced armor. And in addition to that, you've got a strip of spaced armor down the side of the tracks, which is another 12 millimeters of spaced armor. So there's a lot of armor, a heck of a lot of armor on the side of this tank. You can imagine someone keeping their cupola hidden, coming around a left-hand corner, pointing their gun at you with your tank at this corner. Even the side armor, which is flat when it comes around a corner, is still 225 millimeters of effective armor. So keeping this tank angled even when on flat ground makes the armor much, much better. Side armor, absolutely incredible. The rear armor is okay. The engine deck, unfortunately, is sloped, and that means that if you get to the rear of an AT-15A, you can pump shots into its engine deck. It's only 25 millimeters of armor, 40 millimeters of effective armor, so you should be able to pen an AT-15A from the rear easily. However, if you do go for the flatter areas, again, you're going to be going through 101 millimeters on the back of the tank, 101 millimeters towards the back of the turret. It's very, very well armored. RT, of course, are going to try and hit this tank because, as I say, there's only about 25 millimeters of armor on top, and that means RT will hit you. You're slow moving, not very maneuverable. However, if they hit anywhere else on the tank, the armor can be quite good and can absorb a lot of damage. However, if they hit the rear of the tank, they're going to pen and do full damage. But overall, I would have to say that the armor is incredibly good on this tank. So while we're still in Tanks GG, we might as well have a look at the gun, because it comes with the standard British 17-pounder gun. It's a pretty standard gun for most British tanks. You're going to find it on a lot of British tanks in game, so you should be used to this gun by now if you're driving any British tanks. It's got decent penetration, not the best, but decent penetration of 171 millimeters of penetration, 150 damage. So the alpha damage is very, very low. However, it's accurate 0.32, has a good aim time of 1.9, and it's got a very, very good rate of fire. So it's a pretty standard 17-pounder. The premium ammo, 239 millimeters of penetration, makes it more than enough to go through any tank it's going to face if you're willing to fire some premium or need to fire some premium. Now, the AT-15A, when it was first released, this gun got to face a lot of tier 9s. The AT-15A prior to 9.4 faced tier 9s, didn't get special matchmaking, and this gun was absolutely terrible. But 9.4 meant that the tank got a hit point boost. It went from 800 hit points to over 1,000 hit points, and its gun became a lot better because it no longer has to face tier 9s. And 171 millimeters of penetration with its standard AP is usually more than good enough to deal with most of the tanks it's facing, when you consider it's got 0.32 accuracy, which means you can actually hit and penetrate weak spots. So the gun, it's a pretty standard 17-pounder. However, the DPM is not great. It comes in at 2,182, which is pretty good. But when you consider that the AT-15A is up against tanks like the E-25 or the Su-122-44, those tanks have over 3,000 DPM. So the DPM is good on the tank, but it's not very, very good. The DPM really does lack on the AT-15A now and again. But as I say, penetration is okay. Alpha damage is low. The rate of fire is very, very good. Reload is very, very good. The ammo, it carries a lot of ammo at 70 rounds, so you're not going to run out of ammo very often in this tank. The shell velocity is okay on the tank as well. The aim time is good. The accuracy is good. It's a very slow tank, so it's actually very, very good at shooting on the move. And as I say, an absolutely amazing gun depression, again, of 10 degrees, which means you can use this on slopes, and it negates a lot of the weak spots on the front of your tank if you're shooting down at enemy tanks below you. The gun traverse is also incredibly good. It gets a 25-degree gun traverse, so you can get this gun on target even though your tank is facing a completely different direction. Very, very good gun traverse, and the gun traverse speed is okay, as I mentioned in the garage. The ammo costs are cheap, as they are for most 17-pounders. There's a 20% chance of fire. To be honest, it wasn't set on fire all that often during my games for the review. But yeah, that's pretty much it. The gun, it's a pretty standard 17-pounder. It does the job, especially when you consider the AT-15A gets special matchmaking. So let's check out this gun, this engine, and this armor in action. We are here on Erlenberg. I'm platooned with Bringy. He's playing his E-25, a far more flexible tank, let's just say, than the AT-15A is. But you can see we're doing our 20 kilometers an hour already. We're at the top speed because this tank accelerates up to 20 kilometers an hour quite well. And then we hit a small rise. So if you take a look at our speed, we go from 20 kilometers an hour and we're dropping down to about 10 kilometers an hour, just going up a small rise. So power to weight ratio, incredibly poor. Reverse speed is incredibly poor, and the top speed is incredibly poor. So really, I've got no choice but to go down the 1-2 lines with the rest of my team, because if I were to go 9-0 lines, I'd still be crossing the bridge by now. The tank just does not have the speed. You can see we're doing 9 kilometers an hour up that slope, so it's just incredibly slow to get into position. Everyone else is in position, ready to shoot before I'm even there. But what we do have is a decent gun with 10 degrees of gun depression. So you're going to be seeing me use 10 degrees of gun depression here, using a slope, using the rise. We've got more than enough penetration to go through the IS, so as long as we let our gun aim in fully, we're quite accurate. So Hellcat in the distance, and quick snapshot, we put a shot in and the Hellcat bounces. So the armor, incredibly good at distance. People have to really aim at your weak spots, and even at distance there's no guarantee they're going to hit them. Now I'm playing as per usual in a premium tank with a bad crew because I use my premium tanks to train crews, so I don't have sixth sense. My crew aren't very good, but get one shot into the AMX M4, he's at a bad angle for me, and it's going to be very hard to pen this guy. And that shot goes high into the left, so that was quite bad accuracy. But you see, we just actually bounced a Sture Immel. So the armor, he had my side and we still managed to bounce him. RT is my biggest danger here. Bringy's just going to work on tanks in the middle, so I'm going to move up, see if maybe I can use my gun depression again. So the only bushes here, it's a very obvious spot. If I was RT, I'd be putting shots in here, but we've popped up, gonna try and let my binocs kick in, and we spotted a BDR. Managed to track him, he uses a repair kit, but you can see the rate of fire is pretty good on this tank. The DPM may not be the best, but it's not bad. Hellcat, I'm just wondering if he's gonna poke. We aim and the shot goes high. So sometimes the accuracy is gonna let you down. Shot into the Tiger, going for a track shot maybe. No, he's dodging, knows what he's doing. Arl is back. Now, I don't know if I've been spotted yet, or I don't know if anyone is spotting me, down to the fact I don't have sixth sense. Okay, BDR, go for a blind shot, it goes in, and weak spot in the BDR, take a snapshot before being fully aimed, let my gun aim fully, we get another shot in. So here's where things start to get interesting, because I've just taken my first damage. Hellcat tracks me. Even though I don't have a great crew, they're being trained in repairs, so I let my crew repair the tracks.
Enemy armor is hit.
We can pen the turret on the Tiger P. We're being capped. Missed my snapshot. So there's a good, or a very good, I should say, T-43 driver on the enemy team who's moved up. I'm not able to save our AMX. But yeah, I'm obviously still spotted. Enemy RT is dead, so I don't really need to worry about enemy RT. I'm just letting my crew repair my tracks.
Let's roll. We dinged them.
And we bounce on the T-43, so... One thing about the AT-15A is because it's so slow, because it's so unmaneuverable, you can't really afford to let enemy tanks get close. You can't afford to let enemy tanks get to your sides and rear, so that's what I'm worried about here. I know that the T-43 driver on the enemy team is good. Here he comes trying to flank me. We track him, he pens me with a gold round, and we've just auto-aimed, we're advancing, we're shooting. And I don't need premium to get this guy, but I'm not coming down. Absolutely no point. Because he's shooting up at me, he's going to find it very hard to pen me. So his gold rounds are now bouncing. Look how good this armor is when I'm on above an enemy tank. So we're struggling with a few shots. He is penning me with a couple of shots, but he wants me to come down after him.
Another target.
He's penned me a few times, so we'll pause it there and see where he's actually shooting me. You can see that he is penning me. I can't actually see where he's penned me. Okay, snafu by me. I'm not actually spotting where he's actually penning me, but I imagine those shots are going through my upper glacis because I'm at a bad angle. But we wait for him to come out, we get one shot into him, and he wants me to close the distance. There's no point in closing the distance, because that just gives him the opportunity to basically flank me. So being very careful, not rushing in. This guy's in a really bad way, but look at our gun traverse.
Let's locate another target.
If he tries to poke out, we've got him. And we've got the rate of fire. Again, he manages to put a shot into me. So premium ammo seems to be having some or no problems going through me. So he tracks me. That's why I saved my repair kit. And we swing around. We've got the gun traverse. We've got the rate of fire. It's just annoying me. I can't see where he was actually shooting me. Oh, here we go. He was actually aiming for my gun, so it's possible this guy was auto-aiming towards the center of my tank as well. But yeah, he manages to pen my gun mantlet. That's quite surprising. I'm not quite sure what the premium ammo on a T-43 is or how much pen, but because of our extra hit points, now in 9.4 we got a buff, and because of those extra hit points I'm still alive. If it was prior to 9.4 I'd be dead. I only had 800 hit points, but you can see how I played the entire game in the D2 grid square. And yet Bringy was able to move around the map. Bringy was able to pick up 5 kills in his E25. I only managed to pick up 2 kills in my AT-15A, down to the lack of maneuverability. So even though we spent the entire game in pretty much one grid square, we ended up still having a pretty good game. We were able to pick up a Confederate and a steel wall, so the armor held up, even though the T-49 was able to do some damage with premium rounds. Couldn't see where most of them were penning, but his premium rounds seemed to have no problems penning me when I was on a level. When I was above him, he had problems penning me. But we had a lot of hit points. We ended up surviving as a result, and I think this pretty much sums up the flexibility of the tank, because it's not a flexible tank. Even though I had a good game, did 2.5k damage, got 2 kills, and got 1103 XP, the E25, it's just far more flexible. Bringy was able to work his way around the map, initially started where I started, but was able to maneuver, was able to do more damage, get more kills, get more XP, down to the flexibility of the tank, whereas the AT-15A just doesn't have the speed, doesn't have the maneuverability, but what you saw was the gun can be quite good. We fired 36 shots, we've got 70 rounds in the tank, so we get a lot of ammo, and the ammo is cheap, so I suppose that's another positive for the tank. So 36 shots, and our ammo costs only came to 6,300 credits. We earned 60,000 credits, and that was a pretty good game for the AT-15A, but a lot lot of games you're going to be struggling to do damage in this tank because you can't keep up with the action, and as a result, I really don't think it's as good a moneymaker as maybe a tank like the E25 or the SU-122-44 is, but it's still capable of doing a job. We blocked 10 shots with our armor to block potential damage at 2,100, so it's an armored tank destroyer. The gun does the job, the gun depression is great, the gun traverse is great, and the DPM may not be fantastic, but it's good enough. But I think that pretty much sums up AT-15A versus E25. So let's talk about crew, and the crew layout in the AT-15A is extremely good. We've got a very, very large crew, as you can see. We've got a commander, a gunner, a driver, a radio operator, and 2 loaders. And what that means is we can train up every single British tank destroyer crew in the game in the AT-15A. And not only are we training up every single crew, but we're training up spare crew members for other TDs that we may decide to drive later on. So on the original line of TDs, I mean, some of the lower tiers have strange crew configurations. Only 3 crew members here in the Valentine AT. We come to the first of the British TDs with a lot of armor and slow moving. You can see that the AT2 only has 4 crew members, but again, we could train up the entire crew of the AT2 in the AT-15, and we're also training up a spare radio operator and a spare loader. And then things get very, very comfortable when it comes to the mid to late tier tanks on the British TD line, or at least the original one, because the tank like the AT-8 at tier 6 has exactly the same crew layout, and the AT-7 at tier 7, the AT-15 at tier 8, and the Tortoise at tier 9 all have exactly the same crew layout. So you can train up all your crews from tier 5 or from tier 6 up till tier 9 perfectly in the AT-15A. The final tank, the FV215B183, has a slight difference in that it doesn't need a radio operator, but you do get your 2 loaders. So you could train up a full FV215B crew in the AT-15A with the exception of a radio operator. But having a spare radio operator isn't a big issue because some of the TDs on the newer line of British TDs also have radio operators, so you're going to have a spare radio operator anyway. But once again, crew configuration is a little bit weird from tank to tank on the second line of TDs, but you could train up the full crew from the Archer, the Achilles. Again, slightly different. We've got a radio operator in the Achilles, but again, we can train up the entire crew. And the same goes, Challenger, I believe, is 5 crew members. Again, train up the entire crew with the exception of the radio operator. Charioteer is 4 crew members, that's the one. And it's same, the Conway, once again, good crew trainer, 4 crew members can train up the entire crew with a couple of crew members left over. And then the FV4005 has the second loader again, no radio operator. But yeah, you can pretty much train up every single British TD crew in the game in the AT-15A. And if you're driving a tank that only has 4 crew members, you're going to be training up a spare loader and a spare radio operator for when you do need them for another tank. So I think as a crew trainer, it is very, very good. Moving on to equipment, starting off with vents. Now, I do have vents on the tank. I chose to put vents on the tank to help me with my traverse speed, also to help my view range a little bit, and basically make the tank roughly about 2% better. Vents, it's not a must on the tank. I think there's an argument that maybe some other pieces of equipment might be better than vents. Vents is just my choice. Once again, always choices up to you. Toolbox is an absolute must on this tank unless you're training up a repair crew like I am. If your crew don't have repair skills, then I do recommend a toolbox on this tank because a tracked AT-15A is a sad thing indeed. When tanks get to your side and rear, they track you, yeah, the game is pretty much over, so you're going to have to get your repair speed up. Even with a repair crew on this tank, a toolbox might not be a bad idea. Again, I think there are some better pieces of equipment, but yeah, toolbox not a bad idea for an AT-15A. Heavy spoil liner is a a piece of equipment I've been playing around with putting on the AT-15A, maybe instead of vents, because I've been taking a lot of HE damage, and also maybe not so much from the HE or ramming damage, but the biggest advantage in my opinion to putting a spall liner on a tank is preventing the crew from getting knocked out, and your loader, as I say, gets knocked out in a lot of cases in this tank. Heavy spall liner might help with that, but it needs experimentation. Not going to recommend it. I think they're a better piece of equipment, but yeah, it's not a bad choice. I think it might work, but it just needs testing. Filling the tanks with CO2 is a complete and utter waste of time on this tank. You don't need it, even though you've got quite a high chance of going on fire. I think there are better pieces of equipment. Enhanced gun laying drive to improve your aiming speed. Again, it's not a bad choice for the tank, but I just think that 1.8, 1.9 seconds aiming time is pretty good on the tank. You don't really need to improve it, and there are better pieces of equipment. Enhanced coil springs, complete waste of time on this tank. If you're going to be putting a toolbox, or if you've got a repair kit, you're going to be able to get your tracks back on. Improving the track hit points or the suspension durability, not a bad thing, but I just think there are better pieces of equipment. Coated optics is a big choice for this tank. I'm not saying it's not viable, or I'm not saying it's viable. The thing is, it depends on your style of play. If you play the AT-15A like a heavy tank, like I usually do, sometimes coated optics might be a better choice, but on the other hand, the tank only gets 350 meters of view range, so coated optics are only going to get you an extra 35 meters of view range. So even if you do play the tank on the move, I'd still think binocs are a better choice over coated optics. You are going to have to boost your view range somehow. As you can see with binocs, I get up to 460 meters of view range, which is actually quite good. And sometimes, depending on the map, depending on the situation, you're going to have to be spotting your own targets, and binocs are going to help you a lot more than coated optics are. Sometimes you got to play this thing like a TD and not a heavy tank, and as a result I think binocs are a better choice, but as always, one or the other. The choice is up to you. Medium caliber gun rammer, absolute must on this tank. The DPM is not great on this tank compared to other tier 7 TDs. You got to improve that DPM. Making it 10% better is an absolute must, so definite piece of equipment for the tank. Wet ammo rack I think is a complete waste of time for this tank. It's not so much the ammo rack is the issue as the loader is, so yeah, wet ammo rack, I think there are better pieces of equipment. And finally, a camo net is pretty much a complete waste of time on this tank. The camo rating is not great, so yeah, it's not going to hurt the tank, but I think there are better pieces of equipment, better value for money pieces of equipment other than a camo net. But if you're playing on a budget, camo net, toolbox, and binocs not going to do this tank any harm, but definitely if you can afford it, I would put another piece of equipment on other than a camo net. And that's pretty much it. As always, equipment choices are up to you. That's just my opinion. Okay folks, time for the overview game, a game where I show you as many strengths and weaknesses of whatever tank I'm reviewing in one replay. And the reason I'm going through the countdown, I normally don't, is if you look in chat, there's an SU12244 driver going, "Lol, how do you get on with the AT-15A?" And I respond, anytime around now, with, "It's a decent tank, but not as good as yours." So, yeah, you're getting a little bit of the roundup or the summation there. But the SU12244 is saying he just can't make it work. So what we're going to see in this game is pretty much all the strengths and weaknesses, and you can see straight away we've got slow speed. Now I tend to play it like a heavy. In fact, in chat I'm saying it's a heavy tank, not a TD, because that's the way I play it, that's the way I get the best results. We're here in a tier 7 game on Fisherman's Bay, and the SU12244 is saying it has no armor, and that couldn't be more wrong. That really couldn't be more wrong. But I'm going to be playing it like a heavy tank, and I'm going to be heading into town. Now, I'm okay with heading into town. I'm feeling a little bit vulnerable because our KV3 and our T29, the other two top tier heavies on our team, decided, yeah, we're going to go 1-2 lines, which is usually a stupid idea, but I'm going to go town regardless. And we can see already that OI has lost half his health, and I haven't even seen him yet. I'm still trying to get into position, and our team are already doing damage. They're already spotting enemy tanks. and I still haven't got into position. I'm wondering whether or not I'm actually going to get any damage done. I'm basically going to be, well, I've got a little bit of support coming into town with me now, but very few tanks spotted on the 8-9 lines going into town. And a lot of tanks, KV-1 camping. I'm wondering whether or not I should basically turn around and snipe, but I figure the OI is a better target. So you can see me using a corner here. What I'm doing is I'm hiding my commander's cupola, and I'm planning to side scrape out. Oop, get rammed by a KV-1, but I was side scraping out and hiding my loader's cupola, I should say. But then the OI gets taken out by our RT, so okay, we are 2 minutes into this game and I still haven't been able to shoot my gun. We're trundling along at 20 kilometers an hour. I'm going into town. I'm expecting to run into enemy tanks, but I'm okay with that. You can see I'm constantly trying to keep my cupola hidden around corners as I come around them. And there's nothing here, and this is the problem. I've gone this flank, our team are advancing down the 1-2 lines. I've gone into town and there's no one to shoot, so I've picked the wrong direction to go. It is such an inflexible tank, and sometimes it can be such a pain in the butt to play when the enemy tanks don't come the flank you were hoping they'd come. So I figure, you know what, I'm just going to cut across now. If I were to go down to the JK lines, it would take me another minute to get down there and turn around. I'm just going to cut across the field and head towards enemy spawn on a diagonal line. So I figure most of the enemy team must be camping down on that H1 corner. That's where a lot of tanks have been spotted. Still quite a few tanks haven't been spotted yet. But I'm just advancing, and this is the problem. It's such a situational tank. We are over 3.5 minutes into this game, and I still haven't fired my gun. But I'm playing it like a heavy. I'm playing it on the front line. I'm not sitting back. I'm not sniping. And I'm just trying to get into a position to do some shooting. And the next thing you'll notice is I very rarely point my tank directly at an enemy. I'm usually at a slight angle. So that shot, not sure where that shot went, but aim carefully, put a shot in. Not sure whether it went in. And we're advancing. So I'm not interested in capping. I know there must be a lot of enemy tanks directly ahead of me, so... Okay, tank spotted. I'm not pointing my tank directly at the Dicker Max. I'm at a slight angle, using this gun traverse, keeping my armor angled, and we continue to advance. So no sign. Oh, there's the KV-1, so...
Enemy is hit.
Loads of penetration, no problems doing damage to this guy. He's down, but no sixth sense, so I reckon I must have been spotted. And there's the T-25-2, KV-1 bounces, Churchill 1 bounces. So angle slightly to tanks in front and to the side. Bounce on the T-25-2, but he's been tracked. We put a shot into him, track him again. He gets taken out. We've just bounced 2 more shots. At distance, this armor is incredibly good. And I remember, don't face directly towards enemy tanks. Always try to stay at a slight angle. Use your gun traverse. It makes your armor much more effective. We've just bounced 8 shots. The Churchill 1's firing gold. But been a very frustrating game so far, and as you can see, look at the mini-map. I'm being flanked by a Panther M10. Gotta try and use these wrecks to prevent him from getting to my side and rear, but he's gonna have problems penning me unless he can get directly behind me or put shots to my lower glacis. But what you're gonna see here is slow traverse, but very, very good gun traverse. So we get another shot into him as he passes. We're taking shots from every direction now. RT hits me on the front of the tank, and because I'm so well armored, not that much damage. But you can see gun traverse is good enough. Now, this is where the problem is, because... I'm going to pause it there. If that Panther M10 had decided not to circle me, if he'd simply driven beside me, if he'd gone to the side of my tank and parked here, or he'd gotten to the rear of my tank and parked here, putting shots into my side or into my rear, I'd be dead. I would be dead. Because I tunnel visioned, I let a Panther M10 get behind me. He decided to circle me, and the tank was good enough. It has good enough gun traverse to take out the Panther M10. If you are in a situation like this against an AT-15A, what you want to do is you want to get right up to the side, park on the side, park on the rear. Don't let the AT-15A turn with you. But we're going to continue. So I'm on 1100 damage so far. Churchill is still bouncing. And really the only damage I've taken so far is a hit from RT that did 300 damage, and that hit the front of my tank. If he'd hit the rear of my tank, it would have been a different story, but we're just marching forward. Playing like a heavy, playing on the front lines. And when you're top tier, tier 7 game, you can play like this. When you're in a tier 8 game, you can still play like this, but you usually want to have some friendly tanks around you to prevent enemies from getting to your side and rear. So we're just advancing. RT is my biggest fear. Not really fearing the T-29, but we aim. Unfortunately hit his gun. We've got good gun depression, but not good enough to hit him. So here we go. Sometimes the penetration is going to let you down. I'm shooting the T-29 at a bad angle. Going for his commander's cupola and bounce. But just going to advance. I can take a hit. I've got 462 hit points left. But shooting down at a T-29 can pen him, no problems. And the rate of fire, still pretty good. Alpha damage may be low, but the rate of fire is good enough just to swing around, take out RT for kill number 3. So there's still one tank left on the enemy team. It's an enemy T-37. He was last spotted in town. And again, we had a very frustrating beginning to this game, and now we're going to have a very frustrating end to the game. But we've blocked 2,000 damage with our armor. We've blocked 13 hits. The armor, people complain about the armor on this tank, but the armor is incredibly good. But wrapping up at the end of games, another problem for a slow tank. So there he is, he's spotted, but no chance of getting him. No chance of moving over to shoot him. And he gets taken out. So we picked up a cool-headed and a steel wall, demonstrating the armor of the AT-15A, even against higher tier tanks. If you know what you're doing, if you keep your tank angled, hide your weak spots, then the armor can be very, very good, especially at distance. So you will pick up steel walls, you will pick up cool-headed metals in this tank quite easily. But you also got to see its speed. It's incredibly slow. At the beginning of that game, we went to town, didn't have a lot of support, but the enemy didn't send anyone to town. There was no one to shoot. It took 3.5 minutes before I was able to fire my gun in that game because I went one flank and there were no enemy tanks there. Now, if I'd gone the other flank, I probably would have had a bigger game. But yeah, the tank is just slow and you've got to sometimes point your tank in one direction and hope the enemy were there. And in this case, they weren't. So you've got to deal with all the problems of a slow tank when you're driving the AT-15A. But as I say, the armor is good. The gun is good enough. So doing 1,227 damage, not great, but that's because I had nothing to shoot till the end of the game. Only 3 kills, again, down to the speed and lack of maneuverability of this tank. But we still had a good game, 1,068 XP earned. We fired 18 and hit 14, so missed a couple of shots. The blind shot in the T-25-2, not sure whether or not it hit. No, it didn't hit, so I missed my blind shot, missed a couple of shots on the T-25-2, missed a couple of shots I hadn't fully aimed, but other than that, the accuracy is quite good when you let the gun aim in fully. The penetration is quite good, especially when you're top tier. Very unlucky bounce on the T-25-2 is again, but the gun, it's good enough. Great gun depression, great gun traverse. You got to see that when the Panther M10 was trying to circle me. The gun traverse allowed me to kill him. The damage, very, very poor, down to the speed of the tank. I could have had a much bigger damage game had the tank been a little bit more quick, or had it been a little bit more faster, a little bit more flexible. And I received 17 hits with 14 bounces. So once again, the armor is surprisingly good. I don't know why people say this tank has no armor or it's covered in weak spots. Once you know what you're doing, the weak spots really aren't an issue. We damaged another 2,000 damage, or we blocked another 2,000 damage with our armor. We only managed to spot one tank in that entire game because of our speed. We damaged 5, destroyed 9.3, and we did 1,843 assistance damage, mainly down to the fact we were on the front line. So, I mean, we did more assistance damage than actual damage simply because of the speed of the tank. But because we were on the front line, we were doing some assistance damage as well. And it's not the best money maker. As I say, 56,000 credits is pretty good, but I just can't help but think how much more money I could have earned in a game like that had I been in a faster, more maneuverable tank destroyer that had more DPM. So, because the ammo costs and the repair costs are cheap, you are going to make profit in an AT-15A, but I think other tanks will make more profit. But yeah, I think that one showed all the strengths and weaknesses of the tank in one replay. Okay, folks, time to sum up. Is the AT-15A worth 6,500 gold? Well, once upon a time I would have said no. I would have said avoid this tank like the plague because it's definitely not worth it. Because when the AT-15A was first introduced into the game, it was terrible. It was in a terrible state. It only had about 800 hit points, which meant that a lot of tanks could one-hit kill you or even two-hit kill you. And then its gun, it faced tier 9s, and its gun was absolutely terrible. I mean, even if you were shooting and penning tier 9s, you were basically just scratching them, and they could do huge amounts of damage to you because your armor wasn't good enough. The armor could be penetrated frontally by tier 9s. The gun just wasn't good enough to either penetrate or didn't do enough alpha damage to tier 9s, and it was just a horrible, horrible tank when it was first introduced into the game. But since 9.4, things have changed. Things have really changed for the AT-15A, and a couple of its negatives are now positives due to the buffs it received, and the first buff it got was its hit points. It went from 800 hit points to about 1,050 hit points. That means it can take 2 shots, maybe even 3 shots. Very rare does an AT-15A gets one hit killed now. So hit points were a huge positive for this tank, and the armor also got a huge buff, even though technically it wasn't buffed, but it got a huge buff because of the special matchmaking. It meant that fewer tanks now can pen you frontally. Tier 9s didn't care about your armor. Tier 9s could just tear you apart. Now this tank does not see tier 9s, so the armor, even though it hasn't changed, is actually better now than it was when it was first introduced because there are fewer tanks that are able to pen you frontally. And the gun, which was absolutely terrible against tier 9s, now never sees tier 9s. It's only going to see tier 7s or tier 8s. So the gun, all of a sudden, is much, much better. The penetration is better because it sees tier 7s and tier 8s. The alpha damage isn't as bad, and the DPM is okay. It's still not great, but it's okay. And you still have that 0.32 accuracy, so you can hit weak spots if you need to. So the gun is very, very good on the tank. Not to mention 10 degrees of gun depression, 20 degrees of gun traverse arc. It's very, very good, but it does suffer DPM-wise compared to the other Tier 7 Premium TDs. Most of the other Tier 7 Premium TDs have better DPM. Even though the AT-15A does not have bad DPM, it's still not the best. It's slow and unmaneuverable, so it's going to be a pain in the ass to play if you don't like playing slow tanks. It's slow to get into position, it's slow to get out of position. You can't run away. It's one of these tanks where you kind of point in the direction of the enemy and hope the enemy are there, because if they're not there, you've just wasted a lot of time moving into a position where you basically aren't going to be able to shoot anything. You can't react to what's happening on the battlefield. If one flank collapses and you're on the other flank, it takes a long time to get into position to do anything about it, unlike most of the other Tier 7 TDs. So it's slow and it's unmaneuverable, and because it's slow and unmaneuverable, it's frustrating to play. It's also not the best moneymaker because it takes a long time to get this tank into position to start doing damage, and as a result, it just doesn't earn as many credits as the other TDs do. So if you're driving an E25 or an SU-122-44, or even an ISU-122S, you can react to what's happening on the battlefield. You can get your gun into position, gun shooting and gun doing damage. You're earning credits with those tanks very, very quickly, whereas the AT-15A is still trying to get into position while any of the other TDs are already doing damage. So it's not the best moneymaker because of its speed, because of its maneuverability. It's very, very vulnerable to being flanked. If you're standing alone against multiple enemy tanks, even though the armor is great, even though the gun is good, you can shoot your way out of trouble. If enemy tanks get to your side and rear, the tank can be very frustrating to play because it's slow, you're going to be an arty magnet, so it's going to have all the problems most of the British TDs have. If you don't like playing the British TD line or the original British TD line, you're not going to enjoy playing the AT-15A. However, if you do enjoy playing British TDs, then this one fits right in. It's no different, or I would argue that it's no worse than any of the tanks in game already. I think it's quite good for a British TD. Yeah, its view range is terrible, the signal range is very, very average, and it's not the best credit earner, but on the other hand, it's a very, very good crew trainer. So it's about prioritizing what you want the tank to actually be, whether it's going to be a crew trainer or whether it's going to be a credit earner. If it's crew training, it's fine. Perfect crew trainer. And if it's credit earning, I think there are better tanks out there. So yeah, it can be a very frustrating tank, but it can also be very good. It depends on how you play it. If you sort of ignore the fact it's a tank destroyer and consider the fact that your armor is better than most heavy tanks of tier 7, maybe even tier 8, the armor can be very, very good. If you play it like a heavy tank, then it adds a little bit more flexibility. But on the other hand, you can play it like a traditional tank destroyer and just sit back and snipe. The gun is good enough to snipe with, it's accurate enough, it's rapid firing, and it's got enough penetration to snipe with. But as I say, the problem is if your team are too good, the tank you're not going to get any damage out of the game. And if your team are bad, you're going to maybe do damage, but you're going to end up standing alone against multiple enemy tanks, and then the tank is just not fast enough or maneuverable enough or doesn't have the traverse speed to basically carry games. So it's a very, very situational tank, probably best played in a platoon and played like a heavy tank, but yep, that's just my opinion. So yeah, it's a good crew trainer, not a great moneymaker, and it's got problems. I mean, the gun, 10 degrees of gun depression is great. I keep on mentioning that because I love tanks with gun depression. But I think the biggest problem for the AT-15A is the fact it's up against the other tier 7 premium tank destroyers. And, even the new tank, the Scorpion, I've got a terrible win rate in the Scorpion, but I've got very, very high damage done in the Scorpion because it's got no armor. It's got similar problems to the AT-15A when it's standing alone against multiple enemy tanks. It can't take a hit, but it's got a good gun. But yeah, Scorpion, it can react to what's happening on the battlefield. The E25, amazing tank, even though it's no longer available. Much, much better tank than the AT-15A, not as situational. Su-122-44, if you're just looking for a tier 7 premium tank destroyer, then the Su-122-44, amazing DPM, decent armor, very good mobility, much more flexible tank, and probably a much better tank, much more value for money. Su-122S, if it's on sale, just awesome DPM, even better DPM than the Su-122-44, but awesome DPM, and the maneuverability is quite good. So yeah, I think the AT-15A is a lot better than it used to be. I mean, a lot of the reviews, a lot of people who talk about the AT-15A are talking about it prior to 9.4, and it's a much better tank. It's still a good tank. I enjoy playing the tank, but it's very hard to recommend the AT-15A when it's got so many good competitors, so many other TDs at tier 7 that are so much better than it, so much more flexible. However, it's just I don't know. If you're a new player, I'm getting confused now, but if you're a new player and you're looking for a tank that's a little bit forgiving, then the AT-15A is probably a good bet because this tank forgives mistakes. You're not going to rush into trouble in this tank because you're not going to rush anywhere. It's going to forgive a lot of mistakes because of the armor. The armor is incredibly good. You're going to train crews, you're going to learn how to play the game in it, and yeah, as I say, the special matchmaking, big bonus for this tank. So if you're a relatively inexperienced or new player, then I think the AT-15A is not a bad tank to buy. If you're an experienced player, you're going to find the lack of flexibility and the speed just a pain, and you're probably going to enjoy playing any of the other TDs much more. So Even though I like driving this tank and I like playing it like a heavy tank and I love the armor, I find it very hard to recommend the AT-15A. I think it's a lot better than it used to be. I think it's a good tank. I'm never going to call this tank bad. It's not a bad tank. It's a good tank. But the problem is, it's up against some great tanks, and for that, as a result, I don't think I can recommend it, guys. It's not worth it. There are far, far better TDs here, so the only reason I would recommend this is if you're inexperienced and want a tank that forgives mistakes, the AT-15A will. If you're a tank collector, you're going to want to get your hands on it anyway. And the only other reason to buy an AT-15A over any of the other tanks is if you're going up British TD lines and you desperately need a crew trainer. But I think the other tanks are more flexible, more fun, and they earn a heck of a lot more credits. And as a result, I don't think the AT-15A is worth it. I like the AT-15A, but I'm going to say it's not worth it, guys. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.